Referring to the workers of early Russian capitalism, Murphy said, quote, "Their conditions of life were an abomination almost without parallel, and they were forbidden to combat them by organizing trade unions, except those fostered by the police. Life was brutalized, and anyone who tried to bring light into this darkness, organization and purpose into the ranks of this oppressed and terribly exploited mass, would either be broken spiritually and physically in a few years, or in order to succeed, would have to display outstanding qualities which sooner or later would stand forth as greatness." Joseph Stalin, still going by Koba at this point, studied Marxism for years, becoming familiar with the principles of scientific socialism. He was involved in Mesamedasi, the first Marxist group in Georgia, but was often in disagreement with many of the members. He was also a founding member of the Tiflis branch of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. Of course, the RSDLP would eventually split into factions dubbed Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, but this had not occurred yet. Describing one of the differences between the two trends, Murphy wrote, quote, "Lenin held the Bolshevik view that strikes should be given a revolutionary political direction, and that direction must be given by the Social Democratic Party. Those who became known as Mensheviks held the view that the Social Democratic groups should not lead strikes, but remain as study groups and propaganda associations." Ibid. Lenin also emphasized quality over quantity in terms of members. Many Marxists, and especially the working class movement as a whole, had departed from Marxism in important ways. Marx and Engels had even observed this in their time. Lenin, Stalin, and other like-minded people wanted to bring back the revolutionary principles of Marx and Engels. They would forge a party that was like no other before it. As Murphy explained, quote, "The working class had to be provided with a general staff of trained socialist leaders, and must be united in its convictions." Quote, "First the ground must be cleared by a fight against those who wished the workers to concentrate on economic questions, those who wanted them to follow trade union politics, which were concerned only with the improvement of the conditions of the workers, those who talked of spontaneous revolution, and those who relied on local activity and opposed centralization. These varying trends were all in the movement, and had to be eradicated before there could be unity." Ibid. Roughly around 1900, Koba led a group of workers from Tiflis railway workshops. Quote, "He was as poverty-stricken as they. His clothes were much like theirs. The only difference between him and them was in education. He had learned how to think coherently, and had already become pretty expert in explaining things simply." Murphy. He liked teaching the workers, especially when their eyes would light up upon grasping a new concept. He was given the role of organizing the distribution of leaflets to factory workers. This was not as simple or easy as it sounds. In the Russian Empire, this was illegal, and they had to be printed on a secret press, funded by members and sympathizers. Speaking on Stalin's life as a revolutionary, Murphy wrote, quote, "He became one of the hunted, compelled to dwell in secret places, to adopt aliases, and to walk with senses ever on the alert." His first mass meeting took place on May 1st, 1900, where he addressed 500 workers in Tiflis. He would say, quote, "Not much, but a beginning." Ibid. On March 21st, 1901, around 50 leading Social Democrats were arrested, and Stalin's room at the observatory he had been working and living at was raided. He avoided arrest and went underground, supposedly after working at the observatory for some of the next week. On April 22nd, 1901, he led a demonstration of 2,000 people, which was attacked harshly by the police. This was a new experience for the Tiflis workers, as it was an illegal demonstration. Lenin praised the demonstration, and Iskra declared, quote, "The event that took place on Sunday, 22nd April, at Tiflis, is of historical importance for the entire Caucasus. This day marks the beginning of an open revolutionary movement in the Caucasus." Gray. Koba and his friends among the Social Democrats felt they needed a revolutionary newspaper. Murphy spoke of a conversation Koba had with Sylvestia Todria, a member of one of his study circles. Quote, "Joseph asked him what was taught in the legally sanctioned Sunday schools of the moderate Social Democrats, which Todria attended. The young fellow explained that he learned how the sun moves and other astronomical facts. Joseph said to him, quote, 'Listen, friend, don't you worry about the sun. It will not stray from its orbit. What you had better learn is how the revolutionary cause should move, and helped me to arrange a little illegal printing plant. The plant was organized in Baku by September 1901 and was used to publish Berzola, The Struggle, the first social democratic newspaper in Georgia. Koba and Ketskovelli wrote the leading articles. In November, the Tiflis Social Democrats held their first conference, where they elected the first leading committee of the Russian Social Democrats in the Caucasus region, and Koba was among them. He was soon sent to Batum to start a similar movement there. It was a working-class center with large oil refineries owned by Rothschilds, Nobels, Mantishevs, and others. The police record said, quote, "The development of the social democratic movement has made great progress since the autumn of 1901, when the Tiflis Committee of the RSDLP sent one of its members, Joseph Jugashvili, a former 6th-class student of the Tiflis Theological Seminary, to Batum to carry on propaganda among the factory workers. Thanks to Jugashvili's activities, social democratic organizations have begun to spring up in all the Batum plants, at first directed by the Tiflis Committee. Ibid. He put out leaflets, as well as the newspaper, and organized study circles in all the factories. He was enthusiastic, saying at a conference masquerading as a New Year's party, quote, "See, the day is already dawning. Soon the sun will rise. That sun will shine for us. Believe my words, comrades." Ibid. Now that the prep work was done, the social democratic groups moved to striking. On March 7, 1902, the authorities made mass arrests after a period of simply observing. The next day, Koba organized a demonstration, calling for the Rothschild and Mantishev plant strikers to be released. 300 participants were arrested, but he was not among them. He responded to the police action by leading an even bigger demonstration the following day, getting dock and railway workers to join. Koba led the demonstrators to the deportation barracks, red banners in hand, demanding the release of those who had been arrested. The police responded by opening fire, killing 15 and wounding 54. Quote, "How Stalin was missed by the fire, neither he nor anyone else could tell. The demonstration was broken up, but not before it had secured the release of the arrested men. Stalin helped the wounded get clear of the crowd." Ibid. He arranged a public funeral for the fallen workers 3 days later. He always had to be careful to avoid the police, but managed to write a leaflet, print it on a secret press, and distribute it. Despite changing his address multiple times, and finding new places to hide his printing press and papers, the police eventually arrested him on April 5, 1902, at a meeting of the leading party group. He was, quote, "convicted of being the chief leader and teacher in the revolutionary movement of Batum." He was taken first to the Batum prison and then to a prison at Kutai. Ibid. In Russia, political prisoners were separated from those sentenced for other crimes and were treated more or less harshly at different times. They were often herded in large cells, but could talk about whatever they wanted and could have books. After a year in the Kutai prison, which followed a year in the Batum prison, he was exiled to a village called Novaya Uda, located in the Balahansk district, Irkutsk province, in Siberia. Exiles were sent in batches, and it was a long journey, partly by boat, partly by train, and, quote, "many weary miles on foot." Ibid. The village is roughly 3,000 miles from the Caucasus, and the climate is much harsher, but thankfully the journey was made in the summer. He was about 24 now, and it was the first time he'd ever left Georgia. There were many prison camps like the village of Uda, situated in the middle of nowhere. The Tsarist regime used distance to secure their prisoners, but they were also surveilled heavily. There was some social life in these places, though, and they were full of exiled political prisoners, including Narodniks, social revolutionaries, and social democrats of various tendencies. These villages often ended up serving as schools of communism, as many became followers of Lenin. This was where Koba received his first letter from Lenin, which he was thrilled about. Unfortunately, he destroyed it out of conspiratorial habit, and regretted it. Back in the Caucasus, the RSDLP held a district conference, where Koba was elected to its leading committee in his absence. On January 4, 1904, he escaped the camp and made his way back to Georgia, through the Siberian snow, the Urals, and the Volga. At midnight, 6 weeks after his escape, he arrived at Natalia Kistadze's house in Batum, where he once lived. They were surprised and happy to see him, wanting to know all about his experience. He wanted to know what happened while he was gone. He was impatient for more action after receiving Lenin's letter. The same month he had escaped, the Japanese started a war with Russia, beginning with a surprise attack. It was basically an inter-imperialist conflict over territory. The Russian Empire had taken Manchuria, which the Japanese would have been fine with for the time being, but the Tsar also rejected the Japanese taking Korea. Before this, Russian Home Minister Pleve remarked to General Kropotkin that revolution was brewing, and that a successful little war would be just the thing to stop it. However, the Russian army did not do well in battle, and Russian policy was in chaos. The people were not enthusiastic. Quote, "On the contrary," wrote Murphy, "it revealed in all its nakedness the rottenness of the ruling forces, the incompetence, peculation, gigantic profiteering, and total indifference to the welfare of the people." The war had the exact opposite effect Pleve had claimed it would. He himself was blown up by a bomb from a social revolutionary named Sazonov, and was replaced by Prince Svyatopolk-Mursky, a liberal. After this, there was a national conference of representatives of the Zemstvo, local councils, who pleaded for civil liberties, like freedom from arbitrary arrest, of conscience, of speech, of press, of meeting, and the formation of associations. They also wanted a representative national assembly. They were told to stay out of politics and mind their own business. Lenin and Koba saw that an uprising was coming, and wanted the workers to be ready for it, and have leaders to direct it. Returning to Tiflis to meet up with colleagues and see what had changed during his absence, Koba found that the party had grown by leaps and bounds, but was still far from being the kind of organization Lenin envisioned. According to Murphy, quote, "There are two ways of describing the internal situation of the Russian Social Democratic Party in this period. We may say it was torn with dissensions, doctrinaire squabbles, and jealousies. On the other hand, we may say it was in a condition of immaturity, suffering from all kinds of growing pains and reflecting all the moods of a rising movement groping for a way forward." Stalin's appraisement was certainly based upon the latter view. The party had already been divided into Bolshevik and Menshevik lines a few months before his return, at their second conference in London, 1903. The Bolsheviks, the majority, supported Lenin's conceptions of how the party should be organized. The Mensheviks, the minority, supported the ideas of Plekhanov, Axelrod, Martov, and Trotsky. Of course, Koba had been firmly on Lenin's side since long before this. Before and after the conference, he staunchly upheld Lenin's views and combated the Mensheviks, bringing hate on him in the Caucasus. The majority there supported the Mensheviks, and Gray remarked that, quote, "it was a decision demanding conviction and courage." When he arrived back in Tiflis, he found Social Democrats debating the conference decisions, grouping themselves around different leaders in the party. He came down firmly on the side of Lenin. He toured the Caucasus in the following months, espousing Lenin's ideas. He was a fearless debater, and according to Murphy, quote, "his friends of the time tell of the quietness and orderliness of his speeches in these conflicts. While his opponents became excited, he was always cool and measured in his replies. I can well believe these accounts, for the same characteristics have marked his manner of speech whenever I myself have heard him in later years." In these days, he also built up the illegal press that would become known as the Alvabar Press, which was, quote, "possibly the biggest piece of careful planning for the issue of illegal publications in the history of the Russian Revolution." Ibid. He used it to create leaflets, pamphlets, proclamations, articles, books, and periodicals in Russian, Georgian, Armenian, and Azerbaijanian. Many of these he wrote himself. The police, who he managed to evade by using a variety of aliases and moving from place to place, searched for it for 2 years. On April 15, 1906, the Alvabar plant was found by the police. The newspaper Caucasus reported on it the next day. Quote, "secret printing plant. On Saturday, April 15th, in the courtyard of an uninhabited detached house belonging to D. Rostomashvili in Alvabar, some 150 or 200 paces from the city hospital for contagious diseases, a well was discovered some 70 feet deep, which could be descended by means of a rope and pulley. At a depth of about 50 feet, there was a gallery leading to another well, in which there was a ladder about 35 feet high, giving access to a vault situated beneath the cellar of the house. In this vault, a fully equipped printing plant has been discovered with 20 cases of Russian, Georgian, and Armenian type, a hand press costing between 1,500 and 2,000 rubles, various acids, blasting gelatin, and other paraphernalia for the manufacture of bombs, a large quantity of illegal literature, the seals of various regiments and government institutions, as well as an infernal machine containing 15 pounds of dynamite. The establishment was illuminated by acetylene lamps and was filled up with an electric signaling system. In a shed in the courtyard of the house, 3 live bombs, bomb casings, and similar materials have been found. 24 persons have been arrested at a meeting in the editorial offices of the newspaper Elva, Lightning, and charged with being implicated in the affair. A search of the Elva offices revealed a large quantity of illegal literature and leaflets as well as about 20 blank passport forms. The editorial offices have been sealed up. Since electric wires have been discovered issuing from the secret printing plant in various directions, excavations are being made in the hope of discovering other underground premises. The equipment discovered in this printing plant was removed in 5 carts. The same evening, 3 other persons were arrested in connection with this affair. All the way to the prison, the arrested men kept singing the Marseillaise. Ibid. In November of 1904, Joseph presided at a Bolshevik conference in Tiflis, where he pleaded for unanimity and unity of action among all sections of the party for a, quote, decisive onslaught against the czarist autocracy. Ibid. A Bolshevik committee working with him led a workers' strike in Baku, which was a resounding success, resulting in a collective agreement with the owners. This was a first in the history of the Russian working class, and it had a significant impact, with workers from the Putilov works in St. Petersburg going on strike over the firing of 4 men soon after. The strike spread to other mills and factories. The strike that followed was more spontaneous than the one in Baku, and the RSDLP was not in charge of it. The workers in St. Petersburg had fallen under the spell of Father Gapon, who was actually a police agent forming a union that was police-controlled. It was called the Assembly of Russian Factory Workers and had branches throughout the city. Gapon became the leader when the strike started and suggested a procession to the Tsar with a petition. Quote, the most the Social Democrats were able to do was to persuade the meetings of workers to accept amendments to their petition and to supplement their demands with others such as the granting of a constituent assembly. Ibid. On January 9, 1905, Gapon led roughly 140,000 workers to the Winter Palace, with cross and church banners and the petition in tow. Of the appeal made to the Tsar, Murphy commented, quote, could anything be more naive and pathetic? They were not met by a beneficent Little Father. They were greeted by machine guns, rifle fire, and a charge of the Cossacks. Blood flowed freely. In what became known as Bloody Sunday, police reports indicated 1,000 people were killed and 2,000 wounded. Quote, gone forever was the Little Father illusion of the working class. Down with the autocracy became the leading slogan of every workers' demonstration and of every strike. What Lenin and the Bolsheviks had for years been striving to do by agitation and propaganda, the Tsar's Bloody Sunday did in one day. Ibid. Strikes and demonstrations spread all over the empire, and the Grand Duke Sergius, who was both uncle and brother-in-law of the Tsar, was assassinated in Moscow in February 1905. The rebellion spread to the peasants in the spring, and in June, workers in Lodz battled Tsar's troops for 3 days. 70,000 people went on strike for 2.5 months in Ivanovo, Voznesensk, and sailors in the Russian fleet got in on the revolt as well. The proletariat was fighting, but the alarmed bourgeoisie wanted the power, of course, and pressed the Tsar to make concessions. The government announced what became known as the Bulygin Constitution, quote, a consultative assembly with a preponderance of landlord representation, Ibid, in August. This did not appease the people, but further incited them, and the peasants destroyed 2,000 estates by the end of the year. Quote, over 1/3 of the counties were now affected, Ibid. There was an extensive printer strike in Moscow, and a railway workers' strike, spreading to telegraph services, factories, mills, and mines in September and October. Students, lawyers, and engineers joined in, quote, until it became an all-Russian general strike with the country at a standstill and the government in a state of paralysis. Ibid. The panicked Tsar put out a manifesto on October 30th, 1905, promising a parliament and, quote, the unshakable foundations of civil liberty, real inviolability of person, and freedom of conscience, speech, assembly, and association. Ibid. However, it did not promise that the parliament would be allowed to introduce legislation itself, or would have power over state officials. It actually allowed the preparations for the Bolivian Constitution to go ahead, and proposed to leave, quote, the further development of the principle of general suffrage to the group of landlords' representatives. Ibid. This was clearly mostly for appearances, and the Tsar's obvious motive is demonstrated in part of a letter he wrote to his mother 2 days later. Quote, there were only two ways open: to find an energetic soldier and crush the rebellion by sheer force. That would mean rivers of blood, and in the end we should be where we had started. The other way out would be to give to the people their civil rights, freedom of speech and press, also to have all laws confirmed by a state Duma. That, of course, would be a constitution. There was no other way out than to cross oneself and give what everybody was asking for. All the ministers are resigning, and we have to find new ones, but Witte must see to that. We are in the midst of a revolution with an administrative apparatus entirely disorganized, and in this lies the main danger. Ibid. On October 26th, the St. Petersburg Soviet Council of Workers' Deputies held its first meeting. Born from the repression of trade unionism, this was something spontaneous, illegal, and new. It was not headed by Bolsheviks, but by Chairman Shustalev Nozer, a lawyer, and Vice Chairman Leon Trotsky, who had just arrived in the city that day. It was led mostly by Mensheviks. They demanded an 8-hour working day, a constituent assembly, and the arming of the people, by which they meant a militia controlled by the local authorities. Quote, at this stage the Soviet was nothing more than the means for waging a political general strike. Ibid. The Tsar's manifesto called off the strike, and it was called off. However, that changed on November 13th, as there was a mutiny among the Kronstadt sailors, and martial law was declared in Poland. 100,000 people stopped working, and it spread to the telegraph services, causing the government to act. Almost all members of the Soviet were arrested. The Moscow Soviet, led by the Bolsheviks, called for a general political strike on December 20th. 2 days later, 8,000 armed workers began resisting Tsarist forces, holding out for 9 days. The government locked in soldiers, worried they would join the workers. An estimated 4,000 people were killed and 10,000 wounded. According to Murphy, quote, Moscow's battle represents the high watermark of the revolution of 1905. Where was Koba during all this? Quote, much has been written by his enemies and critics of later times to show that he was not in the limelight of events. But the spotlight of publicity is not always a reliable guide. It is often out of focus and too artificial to reveal the real leaders. Ibid. Of course, he wasn't in the most major cities. He was in the Caucasus during 1904 and 1905, which is apparently where the struggle began, lasted longest, and achieved the greatest successes. Gray noted that, quote, Koba was probably involved in many of these upheavals, but working in the background. Long before the St. Petersburg strike, he was putting out leaflets calling for preparations for armed uprising. An article of his, Armed Insurrection and Our Tactics, was published in the July 15, 1905 edition of Proletariatis Berzola. In it, he, quote, waged a continuous campaign against the Mensheviks, who were in a majority in the Caucasus region. Murphy. 2 months before, in May, his pamphlet, briefly about party dissensions, was published in Russian, Georgian, and Armenian. Quote, in July 1905, Krupskaya wrote on Lenin's behalf, requesting a copy of the pamphlet briefly about party dissensions and the regular supply of the Russian edition of Proletariatis Berzola. Lenin expressed delight with the pamphlet and the articles, and their forthright expression of Bolshevik policies. Koba's rebuttal of Jordania's reply to the pamphlet particularly pleased him. Gray. In October 1905, he attended a meeting in Nadzhole Devi, Tiflis. According to another attendee, he addressed the audience from the platform, quote, you have one bad habit, of which I must plainly warn you. No matter who comes forward, and no matter what he says, you invariably greet him with hearty applause. If he says, long live freedom, you applaud. If he says, long live the revolution, you applaud. And that is quite right. But when somebody comes along and says, down with arms, you applaud that too. What chance is there of a revolution succeeding without arms? And what sort of revolutionary is he who cries, down with arms? The speaker who said that is probably a Tolstoyan, not a revolutionary. But, whoever he is an enemy of the revolution, an enemy of the liberty of the people. What do we really need in order to win? We need 3 things. Understand that and bear it well in mind. The first is arms, the second is arms, and the third is arms and arms again. Murphy. He led the Bolshevik conference of the Caucasian Federation of the RSDLP in November 1905, attended by delegates from multiple different committees and from Guria. According to Murphy, quote, the Guria Soviet was one of the best and one of the last to be suppressed. For a number of weeks it had complete control of the life of the people. In December of that year, he went to the All-Russian Conference of Bolsheviks in Tammerfors, Finland. This was where he finally met Lenin, in person. He was a little taken aback at first, as he had imagined Lenin as a sort of giant. He was, of course, an ordinary-looking man. Joseph also thought that there would be more pomp and circumstance around Lenin, that he would arrive fashionably late, etc. But Lenin was a modest and humble man. He had arrived early, before the delegates, and was off in the corner carrying on conversations. Joseph quickly got over those expectations, however, and would conduct himself in a similar way in the future. He was impressed by Lenin's speeches. He later said, quote, I was captivated by that irresistible force of logic in them, which, although somewhat terse, thoroughly overpowered his audience, gradually electrified it, and then, as the saying goes, captivated it completely. I remember that one of the delegates said, the logic of Lenin's speeches is like a mighty tentacle which seizes you on all sides as in a vice, and from whose grip you are powerless to tear yourself away. You must either surrender or make up your mind to utter defeat. Murphy. Koba worked with Lenin on the leading political committee. They finished things quickly so the delegates could get back to the action in their respective cities and regions. Lenin went to St. Petersburg and Koba back to the Caucasus. From this point forward, Joseph was, quote, in constant communication with him, Lenin, and carrying out his orders with all the thoroughness of which he was so capable. He had become a leader.